So if you have your Bibles, you can turn with me to the book of Ruth. And we're going to pick up where we left off from last week. Last week we finished in verse 3 of chapter 3. So we're going to pick up in Ruth chapter 3, verse 4, and we're going to read through 18 and finish the chapter. But before we do that, this is the season of holidays, right? We're all looking forward to Thanksgiving. I don't know, I am at least. I love Thanksgiving. It's one of my favorite holidays. But many people also look beyond Thanksgiving to Christmas. And we all have our own ways of celebrating the holidays. Some of us celebrate with family. And while you're over here, it might be through a Zoom call or through Skype or Facebook or something like that. But some of us will celebrate with families. Some of us will celebrate on our own. Some of us have certain traditions that we adhere to as a family in order to enhance that celebration. We have a couple in my family. We have a couple traditions that we adhere to. One of our traditions that we adhere to is one that I've never lived down after I've talked about it at the church, but it's that we don't play Christmas music until December 1st. So, rule in my house. We don't play Christmas music until December 1st. Some of you may hate me for that, and that's okay. But that's a rule that we've had in our house. It gets broken, especially when my daughter, Evelyn, asks me to sing a song at night that ends up being a Christmas song. So we'll break it sometimes. But overall, that's a tradition. We let Thanksgiving breathe in our home, and we enjoy Thanksgiving together. One of the ways that we do that is we have a thankfulness jar. And we put a thankfulness jar, day 1 of November, on our table. And there's leaflets of paper inside it. This is my wife's doing, so I can't take credit for it. But we put paper inside it and pens, and we write down our thankfulness. And then at the end of the month, we go over those thankfulness. And then next year, we pull out last year's thankfulness. And it's just a wonderful reminder and a tradition that we do to enhance our celebration of thankfulness. But we also have one at Christmas time. At Christmas time, one of my favorite traditions, it's a tradition that I brought to this family because we did it as kids growing up, but we have Christmas Eve taco night. It's okay to laugh at that. It's a silly thing that started because none of my brothers or sisters really, including myself, liked anything else, and we could all agree on tacos. And so my parents decided taco night for Christmas Eve. And we have continued that tradition. We do taco night in my family every Christmas Eve dinner. And sometimes we invite people to join us. And it's a good example of a tradition that enhances our celebration of Christmas. The reason I think it's a good example of that is because it really has nothing to do with Christmas, right? Tacos don't have anything to do with Christmas. Not in very few cultures, even where, the taco culture, it's not something that you eat at Christmas in cultures that eat tacos, right? And in the American culture specifically, or at least Midwestern culture, it's usually a ham for Christmas, or maybe a turkey for Christmas. But it's something big and it's a big meal, but we do tacos. The reason that it's an important tradition for us is not because it has anything that associates it to Christmas. But instead, it's because we anticipate it as a family. It simply enhances our joy for Christmas. Though it doesn't even have the colors of Christmas on the dish. But it enhances our joy for Christmas because it's a tradition that we look forward to. That's what traditions are meant to do. They're to enhance the celebration. The people of Israel, especially during this day and age that we're looking at in Ruth, were a people of tradition. They had traditions that they kept up year in and year out, especially around the harvest, that they would use to help them celebrate those times of year. Specifically, they had the feasts. And these feasts were traditions that enhanced the celebration of the harvest. A couple of them. The first one is called the Feast of First Fruits. This one doesn't actually have to do with the harvest specifically, but instead it's celebrating God's provision of land, specifically the Promised Land, and how it was ripe for produce. And so when they eat the Feast of First Fruits, they're celebrating through that tradition that God had gifted them the Promised Land and had made it ripe for them. A land flowing with milk and honey. And so they would celebrate that in the springtime before the harvest as a celebration of God's provision of the land. But then they also did what's called Pentecost, and we've talked about Pentecost already in the book of Ruth, but Pentecost it came from a feast that really celebrated the seed time and the spring harvest and the new seed time. And so they would celebrate that God had provided for them, and then they would celebrate that the land will produce again. And so the Pentecost feast was birthed out of that time of harvest and then seed. And that was also in the springtime. And then the last one that really has a lot to do with the harvest is the Feast of Trumpets that would happen in the fall. And it was called the Feast of Trumpets because it was a time of harvest where everybody was working out in the fields. And the priests would have to call in the workers from the field for times of worship. And so they would blow their trumpets. And it became a celebration. It became a tradition in Israel that we would celebrate a feast around this time during the time of the harvest. And they would call it the Feast of Trumpets. But it was always celebrating the fulfillment of God, the provision of God, and what God was doing in their midst. And they used that tradition of the feast to do so. Where we're picking up in Ruth is a time of celebration for Boaz and for his workers. And at this time, especially because they're just coming off of the famine, this is an intense time of celebration for them. Because God has again shown favor for Israel. And God has again brought his provision to the people of Israel. And so Boaz and his workers are celebrating a harvest that is probably bigger than they've seen in many years. So where we pick up, that's the scene. Last week we talked about how Naomi and Ruth had a conversation about what it was going to be like to go and be a part of that celebration, and how Ruth needs to change how she thinks about herself and really change what she's doing in order to be a part of that celebration and maybe hope to see redemption. And so she says, wash up, clean yourself, anoint yourself, and wear your best clothes, and then go to the celebration. But here we're going to consider today how God's loving provision, which we've had as a banner over the last few weeks of messages, about how God's loving provision became the center of the celebration, both for Naomi, for Ruth, and for Boaz. That's where we're headed today. But let's read our passage together. Again, it's Ruth chapter 3, starting in verse 4, and we're going to finish the chapter at verse 18. It says this. Again, starting in verse 4. It says, but when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, all that you say I will do. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So she lay down at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring the garments you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it out, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city, and when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law." She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." This passage of Scripture has so much for us to unpack. This story and this narrative has turned on its head from where we began in Ruth chapter 1. With so much calamity, so much hurt, and so much pain. And then in Ruth chapter 2, just a glimmer of hope. We now see a pursuit of that hope. And then a promise being made. But we've talked about it already, that these passages and this time that we've had has been, the last few weeks, has been under the banner of God's loving provision. We've wanted to consider God's loving provision each and every time that we've opened Ruth, because God's sovereign hand is consistently visible throughout the book of Ruth. And each scene so far, though they've had layers of unrest and gripping emotional turmoil, as well as bold hope, all of it has been built upon the foundation of God's sovereign hand. And the story is unfolding just by God's design. There's no guesswork needed here. God is at work in the lives of Naomi and Ruth and Boaz. And it is His glory that is on display as the story has matured into now a narrative of redemption. And for us, a picture of the gospel. So that's again what we're going to be considering today. It's God's loving provision for Ruth and Naomi. The word that we've gathered this loving provision from, we've not gone over it yet. And I'm excited to go over it today, but it's a Hebrew word. And it's the Hebrew word called hesed. When they pronounce it, it has a little more gut in it. It's like hesed. Hesed. I'm really bad at it. But this word hesed is a word that describes in this book God's kindness and His love and His steadfastness and His endurance and His mercy and His favor and His faithfulness. It's a word that we translate oftentimes steadfast love or loving kindness, or in this book, just kindness. But hesed comes with a deep meaning. And that deep meaning really tries to pull out. It's the intersection of God's loving kindness, His favor, and His enduring loyalty. That's kind of the meaning of the word hesed. It's God's steadfast love mixed with His enduring His loyalty and His commitment. And so every time that God's love is spoken of in this chapter, it's talked about as a hesed. A loving kindness, a steadfastness, an enduring love, something that goes beyond who we are or our circumstances and really undergirds everything that's happening in this story. His loving provision is really the true meaning of the book. The book is meant to show us that God is at work no matter what the circumstances are. And it's His loving provision that works out all the details of this coming restoration and redemption for Naomi and Ruth. It's all of it is built upon this sovereign, enduring love of God. Is hesed. And it is ultimately this hesed, that both Naomi and Ruth are celebrating at this moment in the narrative. And it's also exactly what Boaz and his workers are celebrating at this moment in the narrative. But before we take a look at how they're celebrating, I want to just frame this as best that I can for you. There's a psalm in Psalm 136. And this psalm has 20 verses, but it has a rhythm in the verses where the writer is displaying or speaking on some sovereign work of God. And then the second part of the verse, each and every verse, says that He has done this for the sake of his hesed, or his loving kindness. And so we're just going to take 6 verses, but I want you to get the pattern here from the psalmist, verses 1 through 6. And I want you to hear the pattern in the psalm. It says, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who alone does great wonders, his steadfast love endures forever. To him who spreads out the earth above the waters, for his steadfast love endures forever." The rhythm of this psalm is a praise of how glorious God is, and then a reminder that all that he does has been done for the sake of his hesed. So it would read for them, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his hesed endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods, for his steadfast love, his hesed endures forever. Give thanks, for his hesed endures forever. See him and see all that he has done, for his hesed endures forever." This steadfast love that continues and will not stop, cannot be stopped and cannot be broken, this love of God that is here for his people, will endure forever. This is the idea behind hesed. And the book of Ruth is riddled with this word. Early in the book, as we begin to understand the plight of Ruth and the plight of Naomi, we see that Naomi actually thinks that the hesed love of God is gone. That the hesed love of God has left her. She does not have the favor of God any longer. He has turned his back on her and instead is acting bitterly towards her. So she uses that to describe that God's hesed is gone. But then we see in chapter 2, verse 20 specifically, a change happening where there's now hope of God's hesed returning. It's after Ruth has come back from gleaning in the fields of Boaz and has received compassion from Boaz. She's talking to Naomi, and Naomi says, "Blessed be him." Verse 20. Naomi said to her, "My daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." This word kindness is our word hesed. And in that moment, they are rejoicing because they see a hope that God's hesed has not left. That God's hesed has still endured no matter what the circumstance. And so she says, "Blessed be the man who has had compassion on you. Blessed be that man, Boaz. For God has shown his loving kindness, his steadfast love, his enduring favor through him." God's loving kindness has not left. And instead, it is now applied to both the living and the dead. This is the place of turning for Naomi and Ruth. They now see the future, that there is hope because God's loving kindness is here. God's hesed has returned. So everything that they will do moving forward is all in regard to their faith in God's hesed, his loving kindness. But also, Boaz. We've talked about it just slightly, but Boaz and his workers are also celebrating the hesed, the return of the hesed, the enduring love of God. When Naomi was in chapter 1, when Naomi was in the fields gleaning in Moab, one of the things that came to her was news that God's favor, his loving kindness, his hesed had returned to Israel. It's in fact the reason that Naomi and Ruth made the trip back to Bethlehem, was because they saw that God had returned and was offering again in visible terms, on display, was God's loving kindness. That's because for so long, the famine had ravaged the land. So Boaz and his people, right now in this part of the narrative in chapter 3, are celebrating the harvest. They're celebrating the time of God's loving provision, of God's hesed upon Israel again, and God's hesed upon their fields, and God's hesed upon His people. They're celebrating it by going to what's called the threshing floor. The threshing floor was part of the rhythm of life for the people of Israel, part of the rhythm of life for the farmers in Bethlehem. The threshing floor was the finish of the harvest. After all the grain was gathered out of the field, they had to go and prepare that grain to either be sold or to be used. And they did that. It was called the threshing floor. Generally, the threshing floor it was a house of some kind of shed that was created for the exact use or the very use of threshing the grain. And then the grain was also left at the threshing floor overnight, sometimes for several days, as they continued to finish the work on the grain in the harvest. This was a tradition that would happen year in and year out as the harvest came. And it brought with it a celebration. Each and every time that the workers gathered in order to shell the barley and to take it off the stalk and to prepare the grain was a time of celebration. And so they would celebrate God's loving kindness and His loving provision for them during that time. Now, Naomi hatches a plan for Ruth. And that's where we're picking up. Because in verses 1 through 3, she prepares Ruth for the plan by telling her to stop acting like a widow. You're acting like a widow. You're going out into the fields dirty. You smell. Put on your outer garment. Wash yourself. Anoint yourself, most likely with perfume. And then make your way to the party, right? Or to the ball, you could say. Make your way over to the threshing floor. Now this plan of Naomi's is kind of a risky and potentially risque plan. It's risky because she's sending Ruth on her own. And already in the book of Ruth, we've seen 2 times where both Naomi and Boaz spoke of what could possibly happen to a single woman if she were to go out on her own, especially at dark. And Naomi's sending her to go to the threshing floor. Add in that this was a time of celebration where they were making merry that included both eating and drinking, most likely alcoholic, wine. And for Ruth to come there by herself was a risky decision. And there was danger for her. If she were to be seen on the way, there's a chance that she could get assaulted. Not only that, but she's coming to the threshing floor where they're already celebrating. And Ruth has already warned her that if you're in with the wrong people, or if you're seen by the wrong person, you might get abused. Not only that, but Boaz himself has instructed his men not to touch her. It was a regular thing, almost acceptable in this time and in the patriarchal society, that men would just sometimes take advantage of women. Ungodly, yet seemingly accepted in the society. And so it was a dangerous act for her to go alone to the threshing floor. It was risky. It's why Naomi said, go there in the darkness, go there quietly. Don't make yourself known. Do not show yourself to Boaz. Don't show yourself to anyone. Be there quietly and wait until you see what Boaz does. She's doing that because she knows the danger of the situation. So she's saying wait. But not only is it dangerous or is it risky, but it's also a risque proposition. We have to be honest with ourselves here. We want to avoid pushing ourselves too far to read in too much into what's happening. And yet at the same time, we can't put a blind eye to what it would have represented for Ruth to do as Naomi had told her to. Or at least what it may have been perceived as. It was a risque move. to go to the threshing floor alone and to do what your mother-in-law had told you in verse 4, which is where we're going to pick up for a moment. Chapter 3, verse 4. She said to Ruth, "When he lies down, observe the place that he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. And he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say I will do." The perception of this action would have been a risque perception. There's a couple reasons for that. The first reason is because the threshing floor, being a time of celebration, ultimately was a time that didn't always attract the most righteous of people. In fact, there was at least an understanding in the scriptural narratives, especially Hosea really shows us this, as God is telling his people that they have played the prostitute. There's an understanding that at the threshing floor, some women of ill repute might come. And that there was at least opportunity for immorality at these times of celebrations. Hosea chapter 9 verse 1 explains, as the Lord is telling his people that you have been the prostitute, that you have taken the wages of those who go to the threshing floor. And so a woman coming on her own to the threshing floor would have been at least perceived as risque. And for her to then go and lay down next to a man at the threshing floor would have been perceived as risque. And it is why he feels the need to protect both himself, and we'll see in just a moment, and Ruth, after waking up with her there. So it's just important to at least frame this in our mind. What boldness and what risky and risque business this proposition was. And so she goes and does all that she is told. The celebration, as we've said already, is on full force probably when Ruth gets there. She's watching from afar, waiting to see what Boaz will do. And then as we pick up in verse 6, it says, "So when she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her, and when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of a heap of grain." In this time of threshing, the men would come and they would do the work of threshing. But then they would stay the night because this would take many days to finish the work, especially in a good time of harvest. And so as they're celebrating and worshiping God for his loving kindness and his hesed, they would choose then to all remain at the threshing floor to stay the night. And this is what Boaz does. He eats and drinks until he's merry, and then he goes and lays in the grain. There's a dual purpose for this. He lays in the grain to sleep off the merriment, but also because the grain would be left at the threshing floor. Somebody needed to protect the grain. And so he was there to just lay in the grain and protect it as well. But then Ruth makes her move. And we see, starting in verse 7, that and when Boaz had eaten and drinking, and at the end it says, she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. This was the risque move, to uncover his feet and to lay down. And what that was doing was giving Boaz all the power in the situation. As a man in a patriarchal society, he would have a choice when he woke up with her there. It would be acceptable in some ways, and in some circles at least, for him to do as he pleased in that moment, especially in the time of the judges. Who was going to judge him? And he would be labeled nothing that would hurt his reputation necessarily. It might hurt his righteousness, but it wouldn't hurt his own ideas of his righteousness. But in terms of his business dealings, it would not hurt his reputation. However, if Ruth was found out, to have been there and to have laid down, she would be labeled the harlot. And it would make her even worse in this society. And so it's just an interesting moment that's building here. And I think the writer keeps it purposefully ambiguous because he wants us to be asking, what's going to happen? In fact, Ruth herself in this moment has been listening to her mother-in-law, and she's the foreigner here. She doesn't know how redemption works. She probably doesn't even know how to ask a man to redeem her. And so she's doing everything that her mother-in-law has told her to do. And the last thing in her mother-in-law's instructions was, do all that he tells you to do. All of the power in this moment is in Boaz's hands. In a patriarchal society, he can do as he pleases. In this moment, she's been told to do whatever the man tells you to. And we're left wondering, what will Boaz do? I think Ruth was herself wondering, what will Boaz tell me to do? And I think it's purposefully ambiguous because what happens next is simply stunning. Boaz wakes up. This is in verse 8. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. Probably something that hasn't happened often to him at the threshing floor. But he wakes up startled, and he happens to have this woman at his feet. And he has a couple things swirling in his mind at this moment. The first thing is, who is this woman? The second thing is, what does she want? And the third thing is, does anybody know that she's here? Because if anybody knows that she's here, if anybody saw her come and lay down, then there could potentially be some drama. This could be perceived in the wrong way. And so Boaz has this moment of, oh no, like startled. What's going on? This woman's at my feet. The question is, what would you do, right? In that scenario. But what Boaz does is he remains calm and he just asks his first question. Who are you? It's at this moment that Ruth takes the opportunity to share not only who she is, but also her purpose. And she says in verse 9, he said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. At this moment, Naomi is making a bold request. She means nothing in this society. She is the lowest of the low so far. We've been over this. She is a Moabite and a barren widow. And in this culture, she would have the lowest of the low, meaning very little to anyone in the society, except for Naomi, who feels responsible for her as her mother-in-law. But for her to come to Boaz and to ask him, you are a redeemer, redeem me. At this moment, she doesn't have the law behind her necessarily. The law does state that a close relative is required to redeem somebody if there's a need. Yet here, Boaz explains, I'm not even the closest relative. Boaz can, in this moment, say no and be completely righteous. Both before God and before man. He could say no to her. And so it is an audacious request that she's making. And yet she makes it. She appeals to him, not for the letter of the law, but for the spirit of the law. And she hearkens back to a conversation that she and Boaz have already had. Boaz, if you remember, when she was out in the fields gleaning, he noticed her. And he told his people, leave her alone and let her glean. And not only that, but I'll provide for her. And he begins to provide for her and shows compassion and love and begins to give everything that she needs. In fact, more than she needs for both her and Naomi. And then she asks him, why? You have shown me this kindness. Why? And he says to her, because I've seen the faithfulness that you've had to your mother-in-law, but then also your faithfulness that you've had before God. And in this passage, he said, you have come under the wings of the Lord God. You have come under the wings of the Lord God. So because of that, I'm having compassion on you. Well, here she hearkens back to that conversation. And she speaks to him and says, cover me with your wings. Cover me with your wings. Now, some might say maybe she's lost her faith in God. What's going on here? Why is she now pursuing the provision of Boaz instead of the provision of God? But I don't think that's what's happening. What she's doing instead is calling Boaz to remember that he has already rejoiced in the hesed love of God that Ruth has put her hope in. And he has said, you have already put your faith in the loving hands of God, the provision of God. And I'm impressed by that. Well, here she's saying, be a part of God's loving provision for me. Enter into that loving provision. And see yourself now as part of the expression of God's hesed to me. That's what she's asking for. Cover me with your wings, for I am your servant and you are a redeemer. There's a verse I want to take you to kind of understand maybe what's going on in Ruth's mind here. Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 8. In Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 8, it says this, when I passed you by again and saw you, behold, you were at the age for love. This is God speaking to his people. You were at the age for love. And I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I made my vow to you and entered into covenant with you, declares the Lord God, and you became mine. This word that we translate wings, it's the same word that was used by Boaz to say you're seeking God's loving provision by coming under the wings of God. And in the same way she's saying, spread your wings over me, your protection, your care. That word can also be translated your garment or your blanket. And so in some ways she's uncovering his feet and then saying, spread your blanket over me. Spread your garment over me. And so she's thinking in terms of Ezekiel here as God had said to his people that I will spread my garment over you. I will claim you as my own. And I will bless you and make a covenant vow with you. My enduring love will be yours. My hesed will be yours. This is the idea that Ruth is bringing to this conversation at midnight with Boaz. Spread out your garment on me. Claim me as your own. And love me the way God himself loves. And be our Redeemer. There's a couple things here just to point out as we move forward in the narrative. But this is an opportunity for Boaz to be the provider of God's hesed love to Ruth. And in doing so, he becomes for us an example of the way in which a man ought to love and care for and protect and claim as his own his wife. And so we should see, and I've said this before, that Boaz is not the hero of the story. Ultimately, God is. But as men, especially husbands in this room, this is the part of Boaz's story that matters. This is the part that we ought to emulate as husbands. Is that he, in spite of her audacious request, is willing to enter into not his own love for her, but to be the purveyor of the love of God for his wife, for soon-to-be wife, for this woman. He becomes the conduit of God's love for Ruth. And that's what she's asking for. Act like God and let God display his hesed love, his enduring love for me through you. And ultimately, that's what husbands are called to do. In Ephesians chapter 5, verses 28 through 33, it says this, in the same way husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Ultimately, in the picture of marriage and in what Ruth is asking for, is that God is calling the men and calling us as husbands to love our wives the way God loves his people. In the New Testament, that means the way that Christ has loved his church and has sacrificed himself for her. In the Old Testament, as Ruth was asking for it, it meant his enduring love for them, his hesed for them, his willingness to love them forever in spite of the circumstances. This is the one place I will say to you men, just for a moment, that this is where we need to model ourselves after God and do as Boaz does in loving Ruth, in spite of the circumstances, loving Ruth and fulfilling her needs the way that God will fulfill the needs of his people. Okay, so now just set that aside. That was for the men of the church, just a reminder. But here in the story, in the narrative, Boaz has a choice. And his choice, as we've already said, he could rightfully and righteously refuse. But he has a choice in this moment. And moved by her, and ultimately moved by his kindness and his hesed, it actually says, by the hesed from Ruth and then his hesed heart, he moves forward in redeeming her. And this is what he says. It says, starting in verse 10, and he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last hesed," this last devoted love, this last hesed, greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. One interesting note, he's called in chapter 2, verse 1, a worthy man. This is the same word that is used. A faithful man. But he is saying you are a faithful woman. And then he says, and now it is true that I'm a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he will not redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. Boaz's incredible response is an expression of that hesed love of God. Because there's no earthly reason for him to choose. In fact, the next man, as we'll see, will refuse her for earthly reasons. But there's no earthly reason for Boaz to choose Ruth in this moment. There's no reason. She has nothing to offer him. And so he could have rightfully, and by the culture, would have done well to say no to her. And yet he doesn't. In his choice, he says to her, I will redeem you. And now this ushers into a few new things into the narrative that we'll see in just a few moments. But what Naomi says to Ruth after hearing that he has accepted the offer, or accepted the request to redeem, is she says that he will not rest now until he finishes the work. Ultimately, the love of God, the enduring love of God, the hesed love of God, working itself through Boaz, will not rest until the redemption is finished. That's the idea. And so that's going to usher in a few more narrative points that we'll push into next week. But especially this as we look at next week, kind of the process of redemption. How does it work? And what do they do to make it happen? It's going to push that into next week, but what's important for us to see here is a celebration of God's sovereign, loving kindness, or his sovereign hesed. They celebrate his loving kindness at each point in this book of Ruth. And as we leave this chapter, we're anticipating the loving kindness that God has worked through Boaz to bring about hope for both Naomi and Ruth, to finish it. And so what we need to glean from this then is there are two important things that we can take from this part of the narrative. The first is this, that God's loving kindness towards us is not offered to us on the basis of anything that we have to offer him. In the way in which Boaz represents the love of God, Ruth has nothing to offer Boaz. And yet his compassion and his loving kindness goes out to her. He's the one who is making the effort. He is the one who is going to do the work of redemption. She simply has an audacious request. And if we put it into terms of God's loving kindness for his people, for us to concern ourselves that God may love us or that God may even notice us is an audacious request. We bring nothing to the table to offer him in return for his hesed love. Instead, his love, his hesed love, is a part of his character. And his redemption and salvation is moved forward by the love that he has in his heart for his people. And we see this time and time again, that God's love is expressed because he desires to express his love and not for any other reason. Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7 is one expression of that, and then we'll go to the New Testament as well. But Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7 says this, "The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in hesed," or steadfast love, "and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love," or hesed, love for thousands, "forgiving iniquity and transgressions and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation." What we see here in this passage in Exodus is an expression of the character of God, that he, the God, he is filled with loving kindness. He is filled with this enduring love. He is the one who expresses it, not because we are deserving, but because it flows out of his heart and his character. He himself is defined by his hesed love. And so no matter what the circumstance, if he chooses to love, he can love. And he will pour it out on those whom he chooses to love. That means he's not required in any way by anything that we have done, by us rebel sinners to offer his hesed. But it comes from an inner desire to pour out his love. He is filled with love, and he overflows with this love. That's why Romans chapter 5, when Paul talks about it in verses 6 and 7, he says that while we are still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one would scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. It doesn't say that while we were working on our righteousness, or while we were showing some progress in sanctification, or while we were doing good in this life, God poured out his love. No, it says that while we were still sinners, enemies of God, rebellious against him, that in that moment God poured out his hesed love, his enduring love. And so it was not on any basis of our earning, but it was by God's design and overflowing from his heart of love that he offers us redemption. And lastly, the redemption that we receive, or that we have an opportunity to receive, all of it is a responsibility of God himself. That's what it means. The responsibility falls to him and him alone. We have an audacious request. We are in need. We are far and beyond removed from anything nearness to God. But God, in his loving kindness, offers and proves his love for us by acting on the redemption that he offers. And so it becomes his responsibility. It is he who will do the work. It is he that will respond in both love and grace. And it is he that does the work in the hearts of men for them to receive salvation. John 3:16 and 17, of course, is one of our favorites. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but shall have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. It is all given. He is given the credit and he is given the responsibility in every aspect of redemption. Just in the same way that Boaz takes on the mantle of Redeemer and will do all that she has asked in her audacious request. Lastly, Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9 says, For by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not your own doing, it is a gift of God, not a result of works, so that no man may boast. Any offer of the hesed love of God is an offer of a gift. It is not earned. None of us are able to claim it for any reason but that God has shown his love. That God has offered. And that God will fulfill what he has promised. And so we ought to take this passage, this part, this narrative of the book of Ruth. And we need to see through Boaz. We need to see through the circumstances. And what we need to see is God's loving kindness again and again. His hesed love on display. That enduring love that goes beyond any circumstances at all. Offering it to the most broken and sinful people. We too can receive that love. So alongside Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, we ought to celebrate that our God is a God of hesed love. And that once we have received his love, it will endure forever. So let us today give thanks to our God, for his hesed love endures forever. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.